While Trump's America was bombing Iran, China was watching, with a checklist in hand. China has a stated ambition to replace the United States as the preeminent world power, and is watching very carefully for the mistakes of the Trump administration that might give it early opportunities. One such mistake has stood out beyond all the others. But at the same time, it is also re-evaluating some of its previous assumptions based on what just happened in Iran. What it concludes from all of that could be life or death for Taiwan, and a big pivot point in the human history that we all get to live through. So let's discuss. One of the things that became obvious very quickly as Donald Trump arrived back in the White House was that nobody on his team really understood or valued what is traditionally described as soft power. One example amongst many, the administration shut down the Voice of America, which had existed to provide a source of independent news to societies where access to such information might be banned or otherwise absent. Carrie Lake, the Trump loyalist put in charge of it, called it a rotten piece of fish yesterday in her congressional hearing, saying that it should be defunded. This in spite of the fact that the Trump administration suddenly discovered a use for it when it decided to take direct action against Iran's nuclear program. Because in a blinding flash of genius, it occurred to them that the Voice of America Persia might be really helpful right now for its ability to talk directly to the Iranian people, because it used to reach a weekly audience of 4.2 million of them. But after it had been shut down, its partial reopening only recovered a third of that capacity at the point when it would have been most helpful. They still want to shut it down, though. The lesson apparently remains unlearned. You build your audience, you become a trusted independent source, precisely because you're always there and you're there from the beginning, before it's needed. In the case of Voice of America, you're editorially independent of the US administration of the day, so while you're presenting an alternative outlook, and one that's influenced by Western values, of course, you're not just channeling crude propaganda. Of course, that latter feature is probably more than anything what got it killed off by the Trump administration. Meanwhile, China is expanding its global infrastructure to get its narrative and perspective visible across the world. It's putting significant resource into building an international media operation with the purpose of executing on the promise that Xi Jinping made back in 2013 of telling China's story well. It has a network so far of over 30 foreign media outlets, distributing content in numerous languages, over 60 countries, over 100 million people. The Trump administration, led particularly in this case by Elon Musk's Doge effort, also pretty much dismantled USAID and massively reduced the funding that had given it a positive presence in so many countries around the world, while China's been looking to fill that gap as well in many locations, from the Indo-Pacific to South America. So, for instance, Politico reported that Chinese officials have been telling the Nepalese that they would step in to replace USAID support to that country with its own development funding. Likewise, Colombia, which lost $385 million in USAID funding, is talking with the Chinese, who are interested in picking it up. The Democrat members of the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party in Congress produced a set of talking points about how USAID helped to combat China's influence. It included keeping Chinese companies constrained in Africa, helping Taiwan be better prepared to resist a Chinese invasion, training journalists across the world to push back against CCP disinformation, blocking Chinese ownership of ports in third-party countries, combating illegal Chinese fishing off the coast of South America, and so on and so on. That's all gone, along with a lot of the civil society infrastructure that existed with US support, with China experts monitoring and reporting on events within the country, such as China Labour Bulletin. What Trump has put emphasis on, of course, is America's hard power. Yes, it has the most powerful and experienced military in the world, for all that China's has been growing fast. Up until the US bombing action in Iran, this counted only for so much because Trump had shown remarkably little appetite to play that card. His strongman bullying of the various nations of the world really focused on the power of the American economy and the use of tariffs in extreme ways to create pain and hardship to any that wouldn't give him a deal. Not the threat of the use of military force, for all that he wouldn't rule out its use against countries small enough that they wouldn't realistically be able to fight back, such as Greenland, and even there, it's not obvious he will actually take the action that he hints he might. So when Xi Jinping and China's military have been evaluating what America might or might not do about a Chinese movement on Taiwan and growing Chinese power plays across the South China Sea, this has been a very big factor. China expert from the University of Exeter, Andrea Ghiselli, told the Financial Times this week they thought Trump 2.0 was going to be more transactional, possibly more pragmatic, so maybe a more stable relationship. It is not turning out that way at all. Trump's rhetoric has been for a more isolationist America, which has been seen, in fact, in the demolition of USAID, the shutting down of Voice of America. But now, according to one US official who talked to the FT, Trump's decision to order the airstrike on Iran would counter a sense in China that his threats, quote, cannot be taken seriously. I'm sure that's how the Trump administration hopes it's going down in any case. And Taiwan, with its very strong incentive for a dose of wishful thinking, is almost certainly hoping so as well. An analyst of the Taipei government said that Trump had broken the impression that isolationists are in charge of the White House. This should probably help with deterrence against China. But we will need time to observe how China adjusts to this in concrete terms. The Iranian defense minister met with officials in China this week, so discussions about what happened, how US and Iranian weapons did and didn't perform, you expect that would all very much be on the agenda. It also makes a difference what happens next in the Middle East. Trump's stated goal that the bombing of Iran's nuclear sites would be a one-time hit, an overwhelming success, that would enable the US then to shift its focus and its military resources straight back to the Indo-Pacific theatre. But then, what if that's not how it plays out? Because crises in the Middle East have been notoriously resistant to quick fixes, and if it turns out that Iran's nuclear progress has been less hampered than claimed, for example, or it moves to disruptive actions like closing the Strait of Hormuz, America's attention could remain away from the Chinese area of operation for some time to come. Whatever it might choose to do with it, that might present China with a strategic opportunity. Now, my take on all of this is that it would be very likely that China won't be overly swayed by the mixed messages coming out of President Trump's preparedness to take action in bombing Iran in this instance. The pattern we've seen pretty clearly in the last 6 months is that Trump, yes, is willing to pick fights, but only with countries and with people who are seen as significantly less strong than the United States. But when it comes to a nuclear-armed Russia, that has really very consistently not been the case. And in the case of Iran, as we've noted here before, Trump only came around to taking action once Israel had ignored his pleas for them not to launch an attack on Iran. Once they'd launched the attack, and it had become obvious that Iran was less strong than had been feared, only then did he decide to send the bombers in so he could claim some of the credit. He was then able to strut across the world stage as a powerful leader in the might makes right world. Now, in some ways, China should respect that, because its own military philosophy is to organise yourself smartly over time until you reach the point where you have such overwhelming superior position that the other side doesn't even try to fight you. Now, it's not exactly what Trump did, but there's some overlap in not simply rushing into a war when you don't know yet how well you will fare against the enemy. But at the same time, Trump clearly wanted a one strike and we're out engagement. His support base within the United States is predisposed to opposing long wars over other people's territory, and China has a large and strong military, a growing nuclear arsenal, and a fast expanding navy. So he wouldn't get a one strike and done option with China. He wouldn't get the dynamic of hitting a much weaker opponent. So on that basis, do we really think he'd be prepared to get deeply involved? On that principle, it all depends on whether China thinks it would be heading into a conflict with tiny Taiwan or one against the full unleashed force of the United States. I think there's enough evidence to date for them to conclude it would not be the latter, but whether they'd feel certain enough about that to bet the regime on it, well, in that case, events in Iran will likely have given them some pause. That said, on the assumption that any successor president to Trump is likely to be more effective than he is, the argument that says you look for your opportunity while he's still in position and then grab it while you can, because it's going to be better now than it will be later, that's another factor. It depends on Xi Jinping's wish to get his legacy. Arguably, China really only needs to be patient. Trump's America is self-harming in terms of its soft power in ways that will increasingly pay dividends for China. America is deeply polarized, on course for a civil war in whatever actual form that might take. The very essence of Chinese military strategy would be not to interrupt your opponent when he is in the process of destroying himself. So on that basis, why worry? President Trump is doing all the heavy lifting for you. Just leave him to it.